Good afternoon and good morning, wherever you are joining. Thank you very much for coming to this third workshop, actually, of the chapter on why have unions organized. We are extremely honored, actually, to have with us today Jonathan Hislop, from Emeritus Professor at the University of New York in the US, to discuss with us his very, very interesting video lecture on the seafarers organizing strategies of organizing against the Nazis. So, Jonathan, thanks again for this very fascinating case study. And some of the questions we have received has been really very much trying to understand this case study in the context of the rising authoritarianism and right-wing populism that is sweeping many countries. So perhaps if you could kind of give us your ideas of what are some of the most important insights from this case study that somehow echo or could echo the struggles today. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Lyra and Peter, for organizing this, Alejandro. Incidentally, I'm at Colgate University, which is in New York, but not New York University, just for the record. So it's great to be here and have an opportunity to I will just be very brief and talk about a couple of background things and maybe issues we could talk about. One is, I think it's important to understand a little about the industry we're talking about. When we discuss history of labor, I think it's always important to understand the technology. We read about the Industrial Revolution and we hear about the move from hand loom weaving to textile machines. And I'd sort of read about that, but I'd never really thought about it. And then once when I was in England, I met somebody who'd actually built a hand loom, which of course is something you never actually see. And then once I actually saw how this thing worked, I understood something about the time and how people worked and what it meant that I didn't really understand before. So I just want to say a little bit about steamships, because this is something you've probably never seen. There are very few steamships left, but the world we're talking about, which these German sailors were in, was the world of steamship navigation. Now, what you need to understand here is in the 19th century, we're of course dealing with the great age of sailing ships. And the way that that worked was that you have these ships with these enormous masts, and maybe four masts on a really big ship, sailors working very closely together at a very highly skilled level to work these masts, to catch the wind, to move these ships along. And it's a big generalization, but I think one of the things that's really interesting about that time is that sailors came from all over the world, different races, different ethnicities, religions, and so on. And they often actually work quite closely together. There's a remarkable kind of common spirit, I think, often based on this kind of cooperation around making these ships work. And it took a couple of years to learn how to sail those ships. But then around the 1820s, 1830s, you start to see the development of steam technology. And a steamship is basically a giant kettle, if you like. It's having furnaces which heat water, that creates steam, and then the steam is harnessed to power. But it took a long time to work out the technology. So it's only really by the 1870s that you have your steamships with propellers, with iron hulls, and with engines which are really efficient. Now, how do these things work? Well, on a big steamship, what you would have is a huge supply of coal at one end, and the guys would carry the coal in barrows to a furnace room where people would be shoveling coal into these furnaces. And these conditions of work were absolutely hellish, right? So people are breathing in coal dust, they're burning themselves on the fires, they're being killed and injured in falls. It's really, really a horrific world. But at the same time, this allows ships to be much more efficient. And so, for example, in the late 19th century, like the amount of international trade on ships goes up 16 times. So it's an explosion in the world economy. It also enables the top end of the ship to be cleared for passengers, right? So it's really where you get the beginning of the modern passenger liner or cruise ship. And of course, that creates a whole other category of workers because you get many more workers coming in who are essentially doing catering work. So it's like a giant hotel. And the first time you get a significant number of women working on ships as a result of that kind of category of labor. By the early 20th century, you're starting to get the development of oil burning ships, which have much smaller crews because you don't need all this labor to feed the furnaces. But that actually takes a long time to arrive. So when we look at these German sailors in the 1930s, we're still really talking about the world of the steamship. And on the steamships, I think there are two things to be said. On the one hand, because the harshness of these conditions, sailors are often very militant. And you might know about the IWW, the very strong syndicalist movement. There's a great German novel by a guy called B. Traven called The Death Ship, which is about this sort of world of very militant sailors and working these incredibly harsh conditions. But there's also actually quite a lot of racial division comes in because what happens is that the different categories of workers on these ships are recruited in different places. There's somewhat less high level of skill involved than on sailing ships. And then you often get racial divisions creeping in between the different groups of workers because employers are often trying to substitute workers from lower wage countries for workers for high wage countries. So I just wanted to say a bit about that because I think this world of the steamship is a bit hard to imagine, but that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And we're talking about these sailors organizing, living in bunks or hammocks in very crowded, airless spaces at the bottom of these ships. The second thing I just wanted to talk about is about this question of politics. Now, I think the relations of unions to politics is a very difficult issue because, of course, unions normally, and some unions have a very strong religious or political identity, but by and large, unions want to draw in broad ranges of workers. So they want to draw in people who have got different ethnic backgrounds, different racial identities, different religions, and so on. So in a sense, unions, I think, can't be too narrow in what they stand for politically. They've got to incorporate people with different ways of looking at the world. But at the same time, I think it is important to understand historically that unions have intervened in politics because once unions emerge, they understand that certain political conditions are better for them than others, and that who is in government is important. You don't necessarily even have to support the person you vote for, but clearly some leaders are going to give you a better conditions to organize than others. So political questions are important. And of course, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, we saw the emergence of labor-based political parties. But even once that happens, as I say, I think unions can't perhaps be too narrow in their political objectives. Nevertheless, I think there are certain issues or certain types of issues where labor has such an overwhelming interest that unions go beyond just collective bargaining and seek to intervene in the political field. And so I think one of the most important of those historically since the 1920s has been the question of anti-fascism that we've seen over the last century waves of extreme reactionary movements, movements which are anti-democratic, which are against the rights of women, which are extremely racist, and often involving violence and informal and state repression. And unions have frequently intervened to build movements against those kinds of organizations. So this question of anti-fascism, I think, is striking. One scholar actually said anti-fascism is arguably the most successful movement of the 20th century. And in a sense, of course, it is easier to build alliances on what you're against than what you're for. But of course, in building those alliances, then there are all sorts of really complicated questions arise, which is, who do you ally with? What is your minimum basis that you're creating an alliance on? What can we, in a sense, compromise on in order to reach this goal of attaining kind of unity around anti-fascism? And I think what's really striking, of course, is that some of these questions from the 1920s and 1930s have come back. And I think one thing to say about 1920s and 30s anti-fascism is that actually it was incredibly broad, that there was a huge range of political and religious and nationalist movements who took up some sort of anti-fascist position. And in a sense, in a kind of historical nightmare, we're now back often in many countries with exactly that question of these extreme right-wing movements, extreme racism, extreme xenophobia and violence, and how does Labour deal with it? And these remarkable small group of German unionists who in the 1930s risked their lives and in many cases sacrificed their lives for this objective, I think are just extraordinarily inspiring. And obviously no historical situation is the same. And I don't think most people can be expected to achieve the level of like heroism that they did. But nevertheless, I think this experience is an important one to reflect on.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for those first initial insights. Very inspiring. It's open for questions. Some of you have made questions as we usually do in the registration process. Please feel free to make those here now. And as always, please, you can put your questions also in the chat box. So anyone would want to go first? Gifford, why don't you go with your question, although perhaps it was somehow responded in this introduction, but it's up to you.
If you have it, I don't remember it. I submitted it, and was mine about the contemporary situation. I can't remember. Well, let's say, for example, the war in Gaza. Armaments are coming from places like the United States, and they're going by the intermodal and or bulk, carrier trade across oceans. And I don't know, Jonathan, if you're familiar with the Mask Off Maersk campaign of young activists, mostly in North America, in the Palestinian youth movement, who are trying to track how these armaments are being shipped, and then try to reach out to the workers and say, kind of your example of the working class agency of people on the supply chain saying, well, we could help stop this horrendous war. Are you familiar with any and other examples? Do you have any other examples contemporarily?
Oh. No, I actually didn't know about the Maersk campaign, but I mean, that is, amazing example, I think, of what could be done, certainly as an idea, because, that's actually exactly the kind of thing that you do see in this period. And one thing that happens, for example, in Southern Africa in the 1930s is that dock workers actually boycott ships which are going around Africa taking supplies to the Italian army in Ethiopia, where they've invaded Ethiopia. And I've actually been trying to work on this and not really been very successful in finding out much about it, because clearly there was some leftist organizations involved. But one of the things which was also involved was Garveyism, the movement started by Marcus Garvey in the United States, which then influences Southern Africa and is a sort of global Black nationalist movement, and very strong African identity. And it seems that some of the activists from that actually started up some of this, and even, you know, some people in Southern Africa trying to figure out how they could go to Ethiopia and help fight the Italians. But actually, it had a real impact. There were 3 or 4 South African ports, and also a port in Namibia, what's now Namibia, where people actually boycotted equipment going to the Italian army. So there's a great historical precedent for that, and you know, I think that would be a terrific thing if it could happen. And exactly, you know, and I think also your point is good from the, you know, as I say, it's always important to think about the specific technology and so on. And of course, you know, containerization has been the next wave of this kind of technological development of shipping. Again, you know, huge boost to the efficiency of moving things around the world. And if you understand and analyze it, you can figure out ways to try and stop these things being done. So I think that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I think just the last couple of days, there was the same movement in Greece where the trade unions blocked actually a shipment of weapons to Israel. They succeeded actually in doing it. So it's happening in different places. Any other question? Fish, you had put a question in the registration. Would you like to
I
make
forgot.
You forgot to. Well, I can read the Fish's Fish. Perhaps you. Meanwhile, you just introduce yourself briefly.
I think I introduced last time. Yes, this is Fish. I'm based in Hong Kong. I'm a union organizer for domestic workers. Currently, the regional coordinator for the IDWF, the International Domestic Workers Federation. Nice to meet you, Jonathan.
Yes, great to meet you.
And
I have a year studying in the GLU in Germany.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah.
And the question is, can you elaborate and explain why communist and socialist movements failed the test to the Nazi threat? And I think that's quite an interesting question, because we see also social democratic parties in many countries in Europe failing to be really the real opposition to the authority. I mean, different context always, but there is this kind of failure accompanying the left-wing parties.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is obviously a hugely complicated and kind of vast historical question. I'm sure Peter and Lyra have, you know, at least much to say as I have on this. But I think, you know, one would have to look here at what happens to the socialist movement in the First World War, you know, which is really crucial. I mean, socialist movement, certainly in Europe and to some extent more widely, was a kind of very broad church, if you like, before the First World War. So you had people ranging from very moderate reformist socialists to extreme revolutionaries, all in the same, broadly in the same movement, right? And accommodated a lot of views, debated amongst themselves, you know, often very bitterly, but actually kind of stuck together more or less, and had these very broadly based unions. And then, of course, in the First World War, you have these very deep divisions setting in about, are we going to support our country in the war or not? And then that leads to incredible bitterness. And in fact, in Germany, what happens is that at the end of the war, 1918, you have the collapse of the imperial regime, which almost everybody on the socialist side is happy to see. But the far left want to have a full revolution, and the mainstream of the socialists go on a much more reformist gradualist route and become part of the government. So you then have this extreme division between the socialists and the communists, and also they've actually fought each other in 1819 over the future direction of the country physically, and it's become very, very, very difficult. So they never really trust each other again. And I think it becomes almost impossible to overcome these divisions. And in a sense, it blinds both of them to the threat from the extreme right. I think also, obviously, there's the evolution of the Russian Revolution. And, again, sort of ridiculous to say anything about this in kind of 2 minutes because it's such a vast topic. But there's this immense international hope and optimism about the Russian Revolution. But within the Soviet government during the 1920s, you see gradually the emergence of Stalin and his group and their domination of the Soviet Party, and becomes increasingly authoritarian, increasingly difficult to have different opinions. But also, I think a lot of people would argue more and more subordination of the international policy of communism, which is very much led by the Soviet Union, subordination of the interests of the different national parties to the interests of the Soviet Union in terms of what they're trying to achieve. There's also some and particularly bad, actually, I think, is the policy at the end of the 1920s, beginning of the 1930s, when these extreme right movements, notably Nazism, is arising, and the communists insist the real main enemy is the Social Democrats, so they can't come together. But I mean, I think obviously it's a very, very complicated question. We could no doubt debate this for hours. But I do think the main lesson of that actually is that there's a sort of failure by the left to realize there are some issues which are bigger than their own party interests, basically. And instead of uniting against the real threat, they fight each other. Yeah, that's what I would say if I had to sum it up in one sentence.
Yeah, very interesting. Echoing a lot of what's happening today. So thank you for that. Somebody else would like to raise a question or a comment? Ale?
Maybe I would like to comment what we've been discussing before, this thing that the other side of the coin is the organizations do not reply to people's interests, but people on their own decide to organize themselves and decide to move the thing against fascism. So I wanted to make a point on that because it's very important, because that's something we are not seeing in the countries where, at least where I'm from, in Argentina. We don't see mid-range leaders, union leaders, taking the lead on the movement. And it's not, they are always expecting the leader, the major leader, to come with an innovative solution, but they are never proposing one. And this is something that I wanted to highlight from the video experience. That's, for me, it's a key element for the times to come.
Yes.
Thanks, Ale. Just a second. Nico, is it connected to this one? Both of them are from Argentina, so I'm just wondering whether it's the same thread, and perhaps you can...
It's later, Marcelo from Brazil. When you have...
Marcelo, just a second. Nico has put the hand up, and then I come back to you. Nico, so is it related to what Ale said, or shall we let Jonathan respond first?
Well, no, let's go ahead, because while it is related, it touches a different field.
Okay.
But yes, I'm come from Argentina, where fascism is very well involved.
Jonathan, go ahead.
Yeah. So, I think that is a great point. I mean, I think that what's really remarkable is that you have this group of working class activists who, are guys who are, they're not intellectuals, they're real grassroots activists. And yet they take it on themselves to say, no, actually, we're going totally in the wrong direction. We are going to kind of risk everything to go out on on our own and use what we know to organize. And I think there's just an incredible kind of integrity and guts to what they're doing. And then they, of course, come together with Firmin, who's this union organizer who is a very fascinating character, and I think thinks very deeply about what kind of socialism you want. And what I think is particularly interesting about Firmin is that he is somebody who is actually he's like a friend of everybody, right? So he has friends who are social democrats, he has friends who are communists, he has friends who are anarchists, he has this really complicated kind of religious background. And so he's sort of open to everybody, but he sort of sees that the vision of socialism, which the social democrats have got, which is excessively cautious, you like, and reformist, if you like, is problematic. But he also sees the authoritarianism and cynicism, really, of what's emerging from the Soviet Union. And he's trying to, in a way, find a way between these two and to find a kind of humanistic internationalist socialism. And maybe he doesn't quite get there, but he is trying to think for himself. And so these two, remarkable kind of coalitions of people come together in this process, I think.
We may come back to that, but Nico, go ahead, please.
Yeah, can you hear me well?
Yeah, very well. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Very, very interesting, both lecture and this presentation. I have a question which is somehow not directly related, but it touches very much, it goes at the heart of the problematic nowadays in countries like Argentina, where we have a prominent fascist leading, and although also receiving support from lower and popular fascists, which has to do with technology. You are touching this, and I think progressive forces are losing this struggle with technology.
Yeah.
I don't want to go to make it simple, but the way this blood type of things produces consciousness is a monster. But it's also a tool. I mean, people are being. I mean, there's the archetypical Milei voter in Argentina, which is the precarious worker, selling food on their bikes, and they are dominated by technology. So the question is, I mean, are there any lessons we can take from the wider debates on technology? Because I think progressive forces need to deal better with technology. We need to understand better technology and transform it into something that can produce class awareness, class consciousness, but also strategies to deal with. Obviously, the common sense here says, well, we at the GLU are trying to do that, but our success is limited or is in process, you name it. But going back to these two persons and the moment, do you think there are lessons we can take from how technology actually is dealing at the moment with fascism? As I insist, and with this last comment. We in Argentina, we are in a very, very horrible circumstance. And just want to put here, share at the chat, what the individual leading the country, I don't like to call him president, just said that he would love to put the last nail in the coffin of Kirchnerism with former President Cristina N. Is the president calling for active violence, despite what you think of Kirchnerism and Cristina herself? She was attempt to visit a murder attempt. And this is what people are talking. So violence and possibilities. This quote is from yesterday. This is the latest from a long list. So besides this sort of sharing what's going on in my country, do you think there technology we need to learn from technology and how we can consider technology in a different way? Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a great point, and in some ways, I imagine many of you have got better ideas than me on this, because I'm writing about the 1920s and 30s, and in a weird way, like when when I was a young activist, we still had the Gestetner machine, you know, where you would like type things on a piece of paper and then turn the handle. So I'm kind of technologically nearer to these guys I'm writing about than to where we are now. But I mean, just one thing on the history of this. Very interesting that they in the 1930s, the Antwerp group produced this little bulletin, and they were distributing it on ships all over the world. And it's really remarkable, right? Because it's really well written. There's a lot of interesting stuff on people's experiences, what's happened on particular ships, etc., etc. And it's really thoughtful. So it's a real kind of working class journalism. And I think that ability to get people to write about their own experiences is really something I find fascinating. And of course, it was an era also, I think, important to say, of real like working class dedication to self-education amongst activists, which I guess is we've got a bit of a continuation with here. But you know, it's really striking that groups of workers would read really difficult text, and you know, so you've got that kind of literacy dimension. But I mean, in terms of what's going on at the moment, I mean, I totally agree with you, and I think it's horrendously dangerous. And you know, without kind of overly personalizing it, I think the role of Elon Musk and ex-Twitter is really, really pernicious. I would really urge people to study what happened in the UK earlier in the year, these racist riots. So they're basically fascist. What you're getting is fascist activists getting mobs together and attacking places where there are refugees in hotels, or attacking mosques and so on. And Musk was personally, he's got a kind of following of like 70 million people or something, was actually retweeting on his own page these guys, right? And people were reading this and literally going off to, you know, then they'd start following the feeds of these activists, and the activists would say, well, you know, there's a mosque in Birmingham, we're going to go down and attack it. And this is the kind of thing that was going on. So it's absolutely terrifying. And I really don't know how you deal with this, because of course we've now got this algorithmic side that people are pushed to follow more and more radical people. The only thing, I mean, the only thing I would say is that I mean, I actually went off X because I couldn't stand it. But it's probably important for people to be there and counter these people on that terrain. I also actually think the development of the political podcast might be an interesting thing to explore, because I think that is a thing where you can create your own content and promote it. And I think if you get the messaging right and find things that people are really interested in and find the right personalities to do it, I think that is a way of countering things. I mean, I think what's happening on YouTube is actually quite interesting, because there's a sudden explosion of some quite progressive content on YouTube. But it is an unprecedented thing, and you know, as I say, I'm sure younger people have got better ideas than I have on this.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Marcello, and then I'm going to read the question by Isis from Peru. Marcello, go ahead, please.
Italy, may I?
Yes, please.
Okay, Professor, I'm a researcher on Dockers. I'm a researcher on Dockers and the maritime. And I wonder, I mean, watching you in your explanation, it will remain on the 20s and the 30s. Because this is very key to me to understand why such a strong trade union organization, strong Communist Party in Germany, strong organizations, strong Socialist Party in Germany, strong strategic workers within the dockers in Hamburg and the maritime, because the Communist Party had an excellent organization, international organization for the maritime. Mm-hmm. How could this organization become so weak, regardless all the efforts in face of the rise of fascism in Germany. This is key for me to understand, because it was the second most important communist party in Europe, and they were very organized. So how do you believe that it was a division between the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, or the trade unions division? Because how the fascists got uh, these key positions, whether in the maritime organization and the dockers as well, in Hamburg and Bremen, in all the other cities in Germany. And I would like you to comment on that, because this is key for me to understand how is the rise of fascism in a very organized country that was Germany. Germany was an example for Europe.
Thank you, Marcello. Jonathan kind of responded to that earlier, but Jonathan, perhaps you want to add something, or?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, looking specifically at the unions, one important thing was that in the mid-1920s, communists and socialists were actually cooperating to a significant extent. So we're looking at about between 1924 and 1928 or so. And the communists advocating a united front. So what you tend to have as a move towards joint communist socialist unions. So the unions tend to be very broad and inclusive. But then around 1929, the communists decide, okay, we want to have our own unions. So they create these unions which are separate. And then I think did weaken the labor movement quite significantly. I think it would have been much more effective. And obviously it's like, projecting backwards. But I do think that if they'd accommodated those differences within single unions, those unions would have remained much stronger, and it becomes a bit of an obsession with the communists to counter the social democrats. Social democrats are also kind of scared of the communists, so they're so fixated on fighting each other. I think that is really the issue. And there was even this ideology which develops in the Communist Party that, well, if Hitler comes to power, he's not going to last long. And there was a sort of minimization. Well, if Hitler's really not that different from the Social Democrats. And some people even said, well, the fact he's come to power shows how weak the regime is. So, which is obviously the completely wrong lesson to draw. So I think this whole ideology of elevating the divisions in the labor movement rather than trying to find ways to unite it, I think fundamentally undermine everything. That would be my take on it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our comrade from Peru had a question earlier. Why do you consider that FIMAN carried out possibly the first modern political campaign on international solidarity over the working class, taking into account that the first international and Russian Revolution are expressions of international worker solidarity? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it is impossible to overstate the importance of the First World War in the formation of the modern world. Okay, so what you have in the First World War is that in all the major participating countries, there is this wave of patriotism. I mean, to some extent, it's been exaggerated, but there was a big wave. There were big waves of patriotism at the beginning of the war, and workers are often quite caught up in that, but people become very rapidly disillusioned. So during the war, in fact, throughout the countries which are participating, you start to see strikes, you start to see radicalism, but also, of course, millions and millions of people have actually participated in the horrors of the war. And they become more and more skeptical and hostile about their ruling classes and about the idea of nationalism. And I think that creates a very fertile ground for a sense of internationalism. Why the hell are we doing this? Why have we had to go through all the suffering? And I think that the Hungarian situation just happens to provide an occasion for people to see, well, here's this terrible repression going on, and these workers in another country who, you know, we have common interests with, and we can actually do something about. And then, of course, I think you've got to give a lot of credit to Firmin for leadership, that he sees the potential of this issue, and that he also sees, you know, Hungary's landlocked country, largely landlocked country. You can actually control the rail routes. The ITF is very strong in rail, and so it you know, it's something you can actually do. And I do think it then sees the possibility to build public agitation around this. Yeah. So my point about that is that actually I do think if you look at later political campaigns, whether it's in solidarity with the Ethiopians in the 1930s against the Italians, with the Spanish Republic, apartheid in South Africa, against the junta in Chile, and so on, that does sort of set a set of patterns, with whether people are conscious or not, they are kind of following in what they do later.
Thank you very much. Any other question, comment? Yes, Mithu, yes, please.
Yeah.
And please introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, sure. Good evening from Bangladesh. Actually, I am Shahidjaman Mithu, working with Bangladesh Institute of Labor Studies BILS as a senior officer and project coordinator. Actually, I'm not the trade unionist, but you can say the labor activist, because since 2012 to till, I'm working with BILS, and BILS actually doing a lot of activities like policy advocacy, research activities, and to support the trade union movement in Bangladesh. So, and I'm also the theory alumni member, and completed the course of Engage in 2015 from University of Wales. Actually, I'm hearing the whole information which you already mentioned. A lot of my comrades, they have shared their views, and thank you, Hislop, for your kind attention and your videos. I have seen the video document, and it seems nice to me. And then I have learned a lot of things about the Germany, that what is the historical background from them. But right now, I just want to share some issues related on these issues, because you have already mentioned this one term, that union and politics, which is very much important to us, because you know about the Bangladesh right now. We are passing a very turmoil situation in here, but the situation is becoming good right now. And the previous regime was totally full of autocratic level democracy, so that it was very much harmful to us. And if you want to ask me about our labor movement, I think it was fully stuck. That means it was totally based on some politics, but the working class actually suffered a lot of things. But still, we face that it is a part of when the ILO convention, ILO actually in 1919, the first convention adopted regarding the limited work. But unfortunately, in Bangladesh, still we are talking about how we can reduce the working hour for our workers. And you will astonished to know about Bangladesh that the 80% workers are totally informal, and they have no any formal contact. They are not a part of the labor law, so that the mass workers are still facing a lot of problem, and their right is totally violent. And the trade union movement is very much less in factory level. Here, historically, we have found that when the industrial revolution is coming here, then the right violation it started from during that time, and still it is happening in here. But there are a lot of propaganda from the media. Some of the people, they are also doing some propaganda about the trade union movements, so that still trade union is very much weak in here. So historically, we are not very much glorious that we have done a lot of things as a part of worker rights organization or as a labor activist. So there are challenges, and of course there are some opportunity as well. So still we think that all of your solidarity support is very much important to establish the labor movement in Bangladesh. Yeah, it's my comments. Just thank you very much.
Yeah. Yeah, well, really interesting to hear that, and thank you for your contribution. And obviously, I think what your contribution points out is how difficult and specific and complex all these different national situations are. But hopefully, so we can never sort of transpose something from the past to the present in a simple way. But I think studying these experiences does help us to understand these different things that people are going through. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And Shane?
Thank you so much, Adlira, and thank you, Jonathan, for your kind cooperation and your resourceful lecture. And we are very much found our knowledge from your informative lecture. I just add with something with Brother Mithu. Actually, we have a long history about trade unions in our jute sector. That was called a golden fiber. But we are very much unlucky. Now the situation is totally different. Mithu already said more than 80% workers are informal in nature in Bangladesh. So there is no rights about the basic rights also, wage, benefits and others. So trade union rights is so far from there. So so this is a situation in Bangladesh, but we are hopeful and trying our level best to do something for the workers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Marcello, did you want to say something else to follow up? And it would be great if you put your camera on, Marcello, so we can see who speaks.
Okay. Okay, I'm here. Professor, I would like to go back to Germany, the 20s and the 30s, and then understand a little bit of the ITF role within these years with Adon Feeman. It was a great leader at this time. And he was, very, very into because before the ITF to move to London, it was in the Netherlands, and it was very, very, very strong. And I would like you to make a divide between the maritime and dockers, but mostly maritime organization in this period where the ITF was in the Netherlands. And with all this ideological influence, the politics of cadres and etc. And nowadays, where it has a global strength. We just finished a congress in the Marrakesh. It was very interesting, but it's not the same. I mean, the issues, the classist issues covering the other transport workers abroad, and the idea to cover the precarious workers, even though that we still classical workers in this way to organize. I mean, we organize the same as 200 years ago, 100 years ago. It doesn't change much for a classical worker. But when we deal within a docker city, a docker city like Liverpool, like Hamburg, like Rotterdam, like Marseille, where I am right now, we see the changes, and I would like to see how you approach that, the difference between the labor organization in the 20s and the 30s, with all the problems that you point out, and nowadays. Thank you.
Yeah. So I think maybe Peter should comment on this because he knows a lot more about the contemporary situation than I do. But just to say that one thing that's really striking to me about how things have changed is, of course, in, let's say, early 20th century, so really for the whole first half and into the second half of the 20th century, in those cities, you have these dockland areas where you have enormous working populations living around there. There's often a lot of movement between people working on the docks and people working at the sea. People will work at sea and then they'll come back home and maybe work on the docks because it's more stable. It's often very rough because people have very little guarantee of work on the docks. People don't have necessarily a daily job, but nevertheless, these incredibly strong working class communities in the heart of the cities, right next to the docks. And if you look at, London, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, New York, any of the great ports of the world, it's like that. And then, of course, we have containerization. And what containerization does is, of course, it then takes the landing process out of the cities, right? Often moves into peripheral areas. Those working class communities get broken up. And these previous working dockland areas become places where you then build like casinos and luxury hotels and all this kind of thing. And of course, the number of workers actually also gets dramatically reduced because containerization is a mechanization process. So it's no doubt a much more difficult environment to work in. One doesn't want to obviously romanticize the past, but it's no doubt that the ITF really was quite remarkable and gets going before the First World War. In 1911, you have probably the first international strike in the world run by the ITF, and I think ITF, to be fair, does continue to today to be in many ways remarkable success story in having this credible network. But in a way, although the times some ways are less harsh, it's also a more difficult environment to do that. I don't know, Peter, if you've got any thoughts about contemporary issues here.
So just before Peter comes up, what you're saying is that the rise of mechanization and automation and the loss of culture within the docks and within the maritime culture. So it was.
Yeah, I think it's just a sort of spatial thing. I think when one's doing social analysis, it's very important to think about space. Okay. And when you have these very, very dense communities of sailors and dock workers and their families, all concentrated in one place, with all kinds of community organizations, religious organizations, and so on, they've really got a kind of controlling power in the city. So you look at something like the great Liverpool dock strike before the First World War. The whole city just shuts down because those people are controlling the heart of the city. Whereas now the actual container ports are moved to the periphery. People live around the city in smaller areas, and they're much more scattered. So that's what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor.
Peter, do you want to add something?
Just a couple of points, or maybe only one. Employment relations in the period that Jonathan is writing and speaking about were entirely precarious. Sailors signed up for a single voyage, and beyond that, they had no guarantee of work. And the same situation prevailed on the docks. Dock work was precarious. Every day, workers came to the port, and an agent of a particular employer, because there are always multiple employers in a port, would come and say, you, and everybody else goes home. It was no work, no pay. So I think our understanding of the meaning of precariousness and the formal versus the informal economy has been very much influenced by a period in recent history which is in some sense anomalous. Precarious work has always been the norm, and I think that's very important to understanding. It's not new. The notion of a permanent open-ended employment contract and the formal protections that surround that employment relationship are the achievement of the labor movement. They prevailed for some 3 or 4 decades, let us say, after World War II. And the fact that they're being so visibly eroded today is in some sense not an unprecedented development, but a return to the past. I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. Yeah, that would be my response to Marcello and to some of the other speakers who've brought this up. Non-precarious work is something that was built by labor movements. It applied to some workers in some parts of the world. It was never universalized. And its erosion, again, is a return to what I think can be viewed as the historical norm. Just briefly in response to another point, certainly there are many examples of international working class solidarity. But I think the question of the First International was brought up, solidarity with the Russian Revolution. I think what was unique about the 1920 Hungarian boycott is that it was the first international trade union coordinated action against the state. That was new. There had been international campaigns against particular employers, international activities in support of particular groups of workers in conflict with employers, solidarity with a revolutionary movement and a revolutionary regime. But here, for the very first time, you have actual coordinated union action to impose a blockade on a state, which is repressing all forms of working class organization. And I think that was what was unique about the Hungarian action and the subsequent action to boycott arms deliveries to Poland in its war with the Soviet regime in 1920 were 2 outstanding milestones. And I think we have to appreciate what was new in them. And what to some extent really hasn't been replicated since in its organizational ambition and its coordinated nature.
Thanks very much, Peter. Gifford, you did put a question in the chat box. I don't know whether you feel that was somehow responded by the earlier comment of Jonathan or...
Well, it was also similar to Marcelo's question, so I think it was answered well.
All right, great. We are almost towards the end. So Jonathan, perhaps also as a way of kind of wrapping up, one important point you make, which I found it very fascinating, was this, how in the midst of so much terror and repression, the workers organized to both fight the Nazis, but also think about what did they want to have, you know, as the future of the working class, what kind of society they did want to live. So I find that really, really powerful. And it seems perhaps we are being too critical of our times. Perhaps even workers back then were being critical of what's happening then. But it seems to me that we don't have the same conversations, in particular what you were saying earlier, that workers were having sophisticated conversations about the future. It wasn't just about, you know, superficial things, but really in-depth intellectual discussions about the situation and the future they wanted.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And you know, I'm certainly not saying, you know, they came up with the right solutions or whatever, but for example, they are discussing, you know, that we've been so subordinated to political parties, and maybe there's more of a role for unions as themselves to become a form of political organization. You know, in some ways going back to the old sort of syndicalist ideas. But you know, just totally engaged and open to learning and discussing and thinking. And you know, that's of incredible value in itself, and, you know, maintaining their optimism. And, you know, as I said at the beginning of my piece, yes, in some ways this looks a little bit almost crazy now in terms of its bravery, but the Nazi regime, you know, was actually more fragile, I think, than people think in the period leading up to the Second World War. You know, there was terrible a lot of dissidents in the army and so on. So it could have all come apart, and they could have had their moment in a sense. And you know, just the guts to keep going and hoping and thinking about the future, I think it's just hugely inspiring, even if it's not something, you know, kind of level of bravery, which I think, you know, very few of us could pretend we emulate. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think in our modest way, that's what we are trying to do also with this course, and more broadly with different online courses, is really to provide the space for this political education and political conversations in the labor movement that go beyond, you know, just the sphere of industrial relations. So, and we really appreciate your input to that. Marcella, I see you have your hand up. We are beyond the time, unless the question is really burning and it's short. You could perhaps have the 20 seconds.
Yeah, 20 seconds. It's really, thank you so much, because it was great. It's the research I do also, try to understand how it could happen when you have a strong culture and when you have leadership. And it makes a difference. It was not determined. It was in dispute. The 20s and the 30s were in dispute, as nowadays. And we have to strengthen our political and trade union culture. And the dockers and the maritime give us an example from the past. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you
so much, Marcelo. And then let's hope that this is also a space for inspiration from those past struggles in facing the struggles of our time. Well, thanks a lot, Jonathan, for taking time for this one. Thanks, everyone, for being so engaged. We are going to have the last workshop for the chapter tomorrow. Please make sure you watch the video lecture and try and have reflections on the content of the video lectures then for the conversation tomorrow.